Today, I'm delighted to introduce the distinguished Icelandic photographer, film and TV producer, writer and director, Gisli Snaer. Gisli has been honored for his feature films at festivals in 13 nations, including Chicago, USA, Kerman in Iran, and Gifoni in Italy. In addition, he has been the creative force behind a number of highly successful advertising campaigns around the globe. He's also an educator. Gisli has been head of the Putnam School of Film at LaSalle College of the Arts in Singapore and is now the director of the internationally respected London Film School. Gisli, thank you for agreeing to do this podcast with working with creatives and to talk about your creativity. Films. Can we start with your work in films? It seems to me, as somebody interested in creativity, that one of the distinguishing features about the creativity in a film is that it's collaborative. It seems to be a place where lots of different people collaborate. Now, there'll be people watching this podcast who don't know about the various roles that have to exist when a film is put together. Perhaps you could start by telling us some of those roles, and then I'll ask you some stuff about how they collaborate together.
Well, it all begins with somebody somewhere decides that they have an idea for a story that just needs to be brought out and told to the world. This can be a writer, this can be a director, this can be a producer, or what we call actually, and it's not necessarily the only way to look at it, but it's something that is acknowledged amongst film education, is that what are referred to as the initiators. Somebody who that initiates a project. So, and what happens then is that you sit down and you need to write the script, because without a script, you don't have a project. Very often, these scripts are looked at as a high risk, because actually the industry tends to want to work on things, on IPs, on previous published work, simply because then they know already if there is an audience for it or not. Because film production is a very expensive endeavor. Anyhow, so it starts with the writing process, and then and this can take quite some time. I mean, for me as a film director, I could be working on a project for up to 3 to 4 years, and quite often that is the case. I mean, I was speaking to a friend the other day, and he'd been working on for 2 years on a project with a big American television company, and they were about to go into production, later this year, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they decide to, okay, we're passing on this project, we're doing something else. And 2 years have gone into that work that actually will never materialize. So once you have gone through the writing process, and obviously you either finance that yourself or you find finances for it. Here in Europe, we have public funding for it, so you can apply for script funding. It's not a lot of money, but it's still enough to sort of get you through the first stages. Then comes a very complicated process, which is to find finance for the project. And obviously, like I said earlier, if you're doing something that is based on previously published work, whether it's a novel or a newspaper article even. For example, Dope Sick. There's a TV series on Disney Plus now called Dope Sick, and that one is based on a book. And then there are I think there are series that have been made after a published article in a big magazine or a newspaper. So you buy the IP and the right to actually make something based on that idea. It doesn't have to be exactly what happens, but it's sort of the starting point. So this process of financing and finding finance can be very, very complex, and there is no one way of doing it. And in that process, you will engage with, for example, agents and managers and actors. And what you're trying to do is that you're trying to, in the feature film world, it's quite, and this is a business model, a very old business model that seems to be actually struggling a little bit now after the pandemic, because what you used to do was you would do pre-sales. That's one model. And so you would go to sales companies and raise money from selling projects or films to territories around the world. So if I'm trying to raise funds, for example, at the Berlin Film Festival, which has a market and has all these sales companies there, this film might not be actually presented at the festival until in 2 years' time, something like that. So it's a very old business model that actually has relied quite a lot on relationships. We've often been actually criticized for that. It's very difficult to break into the film industry because everybody sort of, we never advertise for members or new members of staff. It's always through introduction because actually.
I can see that. Does the fact that it's so expensive and it's done on who you know in traditionally, and it's based on risk aversion, so you go to people that you know have been successful in the past, or a book that's been successful in the past. Does this kind of constrict the new entrants or the degree of creativity they might bring? Because it has to be safe creativity, it has to be bankable creativity. Is this a problem in your industry?
I wouldn't say so, because that's just one way of doing it. There are many other ways of doing it. And, talent is something that will always find a way to actually express themselves. It's harder and harder, more and more difficult. That's why here in Europe we're quite, supportive of public funding, because public funding allows you don't have to necessarily be, obviously they were not going to give you money unless you have some kind of a success, meaning that you can have a success with short films, etc. And then if there is a producer,
but there is a way in.
There is a way in, of course. This is the cutthroat. This is the big business model thing that I'm just describing. Because, like I say, the other one is what we do in Scandinavia is that there is always a certain amount of public funding earmarked for developing new talent, and because it's in everyone's interest that new talent finds their way into this industry. And what you do is that you try to collaborate with other Scandinavian countries. So you have what we call co-productions. So a part of the funding comes from, so let's say, for example, Iceland, Sweden, and Denmark are co-producing a film, and each one of them is responsible for 25% of the funding. And then there is an extra 25%, the leftover 25% is you find it elsewhere, but all three now. So all of a sudden you have more films getting made, and no one is taking too big risk. Because one thing with obviously when you are producing a film that costs 4, 5, 6 million pounds, obviously as an individual that's a lot of money if things don't go well. And here's the thing with movies, no one wants to go out there and make the worst film possible. Everyone have the intention of making the greatest work ever seen. So, but you simply just don't know. And sometimes there are things that in this, because it's a very long process, and like you said, rightly so, it's an incredibly collaborative process. There are always few people that walk away, and it always seems like as if they are the sole author of the work, and this is completely wrong. But it's always easier to sell if you want a project based on.
Just about that, on that issue. If you come up, okay, you talked about the initiator. I didn't think that's the word you used, but the person that starts the thing. If they have an idea, sometimes a creative idea, sometimes they would be really fed up with having to collaborate, because that will inevitably result in that idea being adapted or being influenced in some ways. And so are some producers or directors very sort of precious about their idea and very reluctant to engage in the necessary team activities that your industry requires?
Well, I don't necessarily think that people are reluctant to collaborate, because that actually is the key to filmmaking. You always work with, as an initiator, you get the idea, and as a film director, everyone that I am wanting on the project with me is far better at what they do than me. So my role is to find the best soprano and the best tenor for my production of Tosca. You know, I want the best orchestra, and so at the end of the day, you end up in a room with a group of incredibly talented people who are all, like I say, because they all come there into the room wanting to do the best work in their career. So as a film director, as a film producer, actually the skills that you need the most is communication skills. That's the skills you need to. Absolutely, and if anything, most people actually, going back to education, for example, what I'm involved with now and why I love it so much is because I can see the talent, because that's what students do. We can't teach talent, but you can develop the talent, and they all struggle with the collaborative process. Because how do I explain what I have in my head to other people, and how do you do it without losing your temper because they don't understand? You know what I mean? It's because very quickly that is. You engage with frustration very, very quickly. So if anything, the hardest bit is to actually learn, how do I communicate what I have in my head without forcing anyone? Because if people cannot own these, instructions, then they will never actually portray them in an authentic way. So the whole thing is about making everyone feel comfortable, making everyone feel that they do matter, making everyone feel that their contribution is of great value, and that if they do not enter or cross that line of total commitment, we will never actually achieve the goal that we all have gathered for at a great cost.
I see that. Yeah, I see that entirely. One of the caricatures that Working with Creatives has invented is called artiste, and artiste is the archetypal creative who really hates working in teams, who really, and we've got another one we call solo.
Yeah, right.
And artiste doesn't like other people's input into her ideas, because she sees them as kind of her children. And you don't criticize somebody else's children. You don't say they could be better if this happened. Now, presumably, there are artistes and solos who like making films. And maybe, and this is something I wanted to ask you about, maybe the development of sort of the iPhone and the making movies in your bedroom, maybe that's allowing for a degree of solo creativity, which is rather different from the model that you've been talking about so far.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's quite a lot of one thing that is happening now, and you can criticize YouTube until the end of times, but one thing that platform is allowing is that there is a lot of young people, young creators who are, creating and making things that are quite astonishingly competent in terms of image quality and light and technical competence that is just incredible. Something that, my generation had to go to film school in order to touch this high-end equipment. And we often talked about 35mm film, which bizarrely we are still doing here at London's Film School, but to a great success. There is a lot of students who come to us because they get an opportunity to actually work with 35mm film, which is not really, it's no longer the industry standard. And this used to be always, the thing. You would recruit into film education, film schools, because people would touch high-end equipment that is now available to everyone. And once you get over that stage of actually letting the equipment run the show, and you start to engage with the art or the creativity, and it's because the restriction can always be technical competence to begin with. There is quite a long period of time, and I suppose it's the same in music. You need to first master the instruments before you allow yourself to engage with the emotion of it. And it's very, very similar. And that's what is so beautifully challenging with good work. So when you see good work on the screen, and how much energy and how the difficulty of battling Mother Nature and getting the schedule, and you see these magical moments, then that's why every year cinema, and films still keep surprising me. You'll never really get over seeing a good film. The sad truth is that most work that we see is okay. It's not really great, but it's okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. Not everyone can be great.
When you say it's okay, there's a distinction sometimes in creativity. The experts on creativity, they talk about distinction between craft skills, which you've just mentioned, and the creativity. And you've sort of alluded to that by saying that you first of all need to get the craft skills, the how the things work, before you can see before the creativity can flourish. Do you think there is a distinction between the craft skill and the creativity, or do you think it's all on the same spectrum of creativity, but just at different ends of the spectrum?
I think.
Or don't you care?
Well,
you just, as long as the film's good.
No, yeah. No, the craft has to be, again, it's quite complex, because all of this has to be related to what the creators are trying to achieve. Because in my industry, it's always about the end. What are they aiming at? And because it doesn't matter if what technique they are using, the goal should be for them to make me feel in a certain way. And if they've done that with and what they do more and more through craft, but the craft is all, it's all for bringing me to that state of reaction and engagement with the work, the visual media work. But remember, film is quite particular, because, like Hegel taught us, it's a combination of all the other sisters of the art. You have music, architecture, poetry, and all. It's all coming together. That's why this medium is so incredibly powerful. And still, we still go to the cinema. It's getting more harder and harder to finance a film for the cinema. But I don't believe that cinema will ever leave us because of that social experience, because the quality, although the quality at home is getting higher and higher, you still need to reserve a X amount of space in your home if you want to have that true cinematic experience. But you go and have that true cinematic experience. But also remember, when we want to go to the movies, we first ask a loved one or a friend, shall we go to the cinema? And then we figure out what film to see. But it's first and foremost this sort of this social, experience. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of studies about that. I'm no expert about that. Why is the cinema still there? But I don't think the cinema will ever disappear because of our need as a herd animal to congregate, to come together. There's a film festival in Switzerland, in Locarno, and they have the Piazza Cinema, which is basically a big outdoor screen, and they do this quite a lot in Italy as well. And you have thousands of people coming there together. They're not really there to watch the film. Film is what brings them together, but they are also there to catch up on have to have a nice dinner, watch some film and all of that. But it's not like they're always going to like everything that's going to be screened, but it's more the social gathering, the social experience.
So if we were starting from scratch, and imagine cinema doesn't exist, but we have all the technology that we have today, would cinema be invented today?
Yeah, I can't see how cinema cannot be, because again, remember, there's the inheritance of the theater and all of that, this whole congregation experience, and we just need other human beings, and as cinema, what cinema is really good at is to allow us to engage and grow in terms of empathy and sympathy. For example, remember there's this film about the horrible serial killer Hannibal Lecter, possibly the most outrageous, serial killer film history has ever we've ever seen. And yet when it's the film The Silence of the Lambs, and you kind of feel sympathy for him because he's locked in a prison. even though we all know he's a dangerous man, you do not want to be with him, but the way he's treated, and also, again, these are the storytelling tools. The storytellers are really manipulating us into actually feeling sympathy for him, even though we also understand that he's actually dangerous.
So the end result, the reason why a film is a good film or a bad film is because it has either failed or succeeded in generating a form of empathy, or at least a reaction in the part of the viewer.
Correct, and that you feel, that everything you're watching and seeing, it matters.
Yeah. Now, my big confession to you today is I've always found cinema a difficult medium. It's not. I'm not naturally at home watching movies, and certainly not when I'm actually in a cinema where there's somebody eating sweets next to me. So when I watch a film, which I confess isn't very frequently, I do so on my own in front of a TV screen. But one of the reasons I have wondered why I'm not a natural film person, and I think it's partly to do with what you've just said, that it's looking for a reaction. A successful film will evoke a reaction in me, or some empathy, or some hatred, or anger, or determination to start the revolution tomorrow. And that seems to me to be rather different from most other art forms, in that it's about the product, it's about what's in front of me at the end of the day, rather than the process through which that has taken place. It seems to me that in most art forms, contemporary art forms today, we're more interested as observers in the process of having got there rather than in the thing that is achieved at the end. Whereas film seems to be stuck in an old idea where all the process is kept invisible from us, and we're ended up with a perfect product. I was watching just last night some of the old 1960s Andy Warhol films. Chelsea, Girls in Chelsea, for example. And I think one of the reasons why they are not successful as movies is because he was concerned with the process of getting there, with the process of the actors, the process of filming it, the process of what film is. And so it kind of contradicts this, to my mind, difficult to comprehend emphasis on the product rather than on the process. But that's my confession. I've come clean.
Yeah, no, I mean, I share that sentiment with you. I'm not a big fan of Andy Warhol's, films like the film Sleep, and that's a one shot of a man who's sleeping for 8 hours.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's more conceptual art rather than actually film as I see it and as I perceive it and as I try to engage with it is first and foremost a storytelling. It's a form of storytelling, but it is a very powerful storytelling because of it. It facilitates for all the arts to come together in a way that actually is quite impactful. So for me, of course, it is. We often talk about if you don't have anything to tell, then obviously don't join the world of cinema.
Yeah. And do you ever find students who do that? Do you ever find students who actually don't have anything to say but can not say it very eloquently?
I think you're onto something there. Indeed, it is always about everyone has something to say. That is the beauty of the world of storytelling. Everyone has a story to tell. It might be a shared experience, but it's a perspective that that can be quite interesting and even more interesting than your own. Going to a supermarket is sounds like a mundane affair, but somebody with the right, shall we say, storytelling skills is able to actually turn that mundane affair into something either hilarious or terrifying. So it is, the magic is indeed to be able to look beyond the mundane and see it's extraordinary in the ordinary, really. But there are ways of doing that, and I suppose the what has ruined it quite a lot, well, not ruined it, that's not really fair to say it, is that I suppose the secrets are more out there in the open, if we can call it secrets. But there are of course ways of actually building up, and we use the tools of the 3-act structure and we know that something has to begin. A man walks into a bar, and then something happens, and the bartender says, and then comes a resolution, which is usually the punchline in the joke. I mean, that kind of form is so, and we know that because we always want to see something that is so sort of inevitable but not predictable. I suppose that's the challenge for the storyteller. You put together all these elements, so when something happens out that is sort of a surprise, it is inevitable, rather than for you to say, I knew it. It was the daughter of the sheriff who is the murderer. You shouldn't see that in the beginning of the story. You should see it at the time when it's actually revealed. Now, going back to the collaborative element and why so many projects are less successful than others, I'm not saying this is always the case, but quite often it is possible that there are too many chefs that spoil then the soup.
Yes, that's what I was wondering. I was wondering that. There's a famous quotation by one creativity expert who says, vision is not a group activity.
That is true, but you see, the thing for cinema is that it has a very, I dare to say, perverted relationship with business, because you cannot allow yourself to be dictated too much by finance. And yet that's untrue, because if you do not recoup the money that has been invested in the project, then you will never work in this town again. End quote. So meaning that you need to be, of course, perfectly aware that this is an extremely expensive affair, and there's a lot of people, involved with it, and a lot, and it can hurt.
And Gisli, is that constraint, that financial constraint, sometimes an advantage? Sometimes it's a spur or a useful scaffold to the creativity that has to go on inside it, or is it always a constraint that you're fighting against?
First, no film has enough time or enough budget. Secondly, it is all constraints and restraints are good because it forces you to come up with the right solution, not the best solution. The thing in cinema, the best solution is always the most expensive one. And you can forget about it immediately because it's also the easiest one. So what I'm trying to get at is that no, all of these constraints and restraints are a good thing, because that's where you really apply your creativity. Let me give you a sample. I was working on a film. It was a very expensive film, and we were shooting in the middle of a winter. And we had managed to shoot all the exterior scenes. So you always start with exterior before going interior, because you also, if there's bad weather outside, you can also go into a studio for what we call a rain cover. Anyhow, there was this big scene where you had something like 50 horses, 30 sheep, and a crowd of 80, and and soldiers, and I mean, one of the big scene. But we couldn't film it because the night before filming it, there had been a storm that actually came over the country, and basically the set that we had built, I think there was something like 70 tons of timber, was scattered all over the place in the form of little toothpicks. And we all came in there absolutely, and the poor producer, she just came over and said to me, listen, Gisli, we can't rebuild this. We don't have any money. You have to find another solution. And I'm like, I have to find another solution? Oh my God, how do I do this? That was the initial, you initially react in panic because you had never actually applied your mind to it. And then it was like, okay, let's sit down. We need to come up with a plan. What are we trying to say in this scene? What is actually happening? So once you start to actually, you find the core of the scene, what is the purpose? What's the purpose of the scene? What is it trying to convey? All of a sudden, we're like, no, of course, we can do it inside, because actually, and late we did move the whole thing inside. And actually, the results were far more powerful, because we really started to, you could argue, well, why wouldn't you know that beforehand? Well, I did know it beforehand, but I had another way of actually staging that and telling that same story.
Originally you'd caught onto an easier solution that didn't actually prompt your creativity. So you probably were more creative because you had to use your creativity rather than reach for an easy solution.
Well, yes and no, because I suppose that, you see, this is why I never say no to any suggestions with my collaborators, because there are 100 ways of doing the same thing. But first and foremost, cinema is a spectacle. and at least that film that I was doing, it was a spectacle. It was grand in its presentation of a simple story. And I could do the same thing with just one shot and in a tiny little room, but I doubt that actually I could fill the cinema with it was a kids movie, so they needed to see the spectacle of it. And this scene was written. It was the right thing to do. It was a big spectacle, a lot of people, because it was a big thing. It was a very important scene. But like I say, we couldn't afford to do it like that. Okay, how do we do the same thing, the same results, but in a different way with what we have? So
it's encouraging what you say, and all the different artists I've spoken to say the same thing, that constraints are usually a good thing, and that certainly, I was just writing the other day about the commissioning of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, where Count, I can't remember his name, cost 500 florins, I remember. That's all I can remember as the fee. And he just simply asked Beethoven to write him a symphony. And Beethoven knows what a symphony is. He knows the normal range of movements. He knows the constraints that he has in terms of the keys he has to move through, or the structure of each movement. And yet what he then does is take those constraints and then, with his creativity, produce something truly revolutionary, and to produce something that almost breaks those constraints, that tests those constraints. And so the creativity is in working within a set of constraints, but testing them and examining them and analyzing them and coming up with something that is truly new and actually moves the art form on as well at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think constraints also force you to come up with a strategy of like in film production. It's work over many days, and you sort of look at, okay, where do I really need time? For example, where are the spectacle scenes? Where are the most expensive scenes? And you try to sort of build, more time for these than the smaller ones. So you have a little bit of a wriggle room there to work within your budget. But like in this case, this can always happen basically the night before, and so you have to come up with a solution quickly. And here's the thing also, we couldn't overthink it, because very often, as you know, in the creative industries, we come up with a brilliant idea, then we overthink it almost to the point that we realize it's actually a terrible idea, only to actually find ourselves in development hell, only to go back months later to the original idea and realizing that actually was the idea.
Yeah. One of the things that always interests me, almost about any art form, certainly literature and music, is that audiences like it to look as though it hasn't been thought about. That they like it to appear improvisatory, or to imagine that the writer's just written that poem without thought, or produced that film. I would have thought with film, you've talked about the huge length of time these things take from initial concept to being in a cinema. These things, I would have thought films is one of the most thought about, worked out art forms, partly because there's so much money involved that you've got to get it right. You can't change your cast halfway through, so you've got to get it right first time. And so how does a film maintain that feeling of spontaneity to the observer, when in fact it's the least spontaneous thing in the world?
Well, that's where the magic of the actors comes in, and I mean, of course, you have strategies in terms of making the camera look as if it's not catching, and the directors come up with strategy about that. They ask the actors to change if somebody's running. I remember Born Identity, for example, in order to get the sort of authenticity, he would ask the actor to change his path constantly, so the camera would lose the actor and try to find him again to create that sort of panic. So it's quite authentic. But here comes the magic of the actors. I mean, I never cease to be amazed by a performance by an actor who brings, because it's possibly the hardest work in the world, to me at least, because again, having to be authentic and sort of, shall we say, as realistic as possible for 6 to 12 takes is an incredibly hard work. some directors have chosen to do, quite a lot of takes to get the actors tired, and so they stop acting. I don't believe in that. I quite the opposite, because if an actor isn't actually getting it within 6 takes, I personally am doing something wrong. They're not understanding what I'm asking them to do. Again, going back to what a film director really does. It's film director really is a communicator.
From that idea, that old Russian theory of the Stanislavskian acting technique, where the actor is trained to be able to appear authentic. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it in films, which I see increasingly, is you don't get actors to act in films. You get people off the streets to act in the films, to do what they would do naturally. So they're not acting it, they're simply doing it. Is that another way to authenticity that you approve of?
No. Well, yes and no. I mean, because when you say to an amateur act, they start
to act.
And so they start to act rather than to be authentic.
Which is the last thing you want.
It is the last thing you want, indeed. And not only that, you need to have the opportunity of do several takes, because it's not really perfect, and it doesn't have the right pacing. It doesn't have the right, it's not going to cut nicely together with the previous shot or the after shot. So I mean, when you work with an amateur, someone who's never done anything like that, if you take them through the process of how an actor prepares, and it's quite a lot of work, and that's the difference between a professional actor. That's what they do. It's just like I say, a soloist with an orchestra. That's what they do. So they come in, they have one rehearsal, and then there's a concert. It's the same thing with an actor. They absolutely come incredibly prepared, sometimes over prepared. That can be also an issue. But usually when you have a big project like a feature film, there's quite a lot of commitment. So you have a lot of time to sit down and work out the character and the backstory and all of these things that actually influence the performance. And then you, as a director, you are the audience. So if somebody is doing a moving thing and I'm in tears, then the actor knows, because it's a very hard thing, because they can never pass a judgment on their own performance. That's why you have a lot of insecurity.
There's another creative caricature we have called Wobbly, who is psychologically extremely wobbly, and what wobbles because it's a job he loves doing, and he can't believe his luck will hold and he'll get another job. It's also a job where he is being judged from scratch every time. He's only ever as good as his last performance. And so psychological wobbliness is endemic, I would have thought, in your profession as it is in music and mine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, because again, they, unlike the theater, for example, an actor soaks up the energy in the room. They know when they're doing good things. And almost to the point, I remember there was an actor that I was working with many years ago, and he was a huge star, and he was he was a statesman, he was an actor, and he was notorious for sort of, at the beginning of each play that he was playing, he would go, out of position and walk up to the audience almost and deliver a line to the audience, just to sort of get the audience to almost break into applause, and that gave him the energy to finish the play. So I mean, but in film you don't really have that. If anything, you have a lot of because between takes, a film set is a very noisy environment. That's why I'm very careful as like, do not call us onto the stage until you're ready, because once we start shooting, I don't want you to move the lights, I don't want you to move the microphone. Do not move. And that's the mistakes most you do as a young filmmaker. You basically, everyone start to readjust their things. No, that's not how you do it. Because once you're working the actor into the role, because again, they're starting for every take, they have to fire up the engine again. It's very, very difficult, and having to do that several times a day, I mean, you're absolutely knackered at the end of the day. So you work there with the actor, and you're supporting the actor to deliver a line or an emotion to the best abilities. And if they are not good, all of the hard work of everyone else, 3 or 4 years, is absolutely wasted. So that's the whole idea. If they are not good, all of our work has been wasted.
The creativity, so therefore the level of creativity needed in the actor is fundamental to the success of the corporate creativity. I assume, though, that there must be a lot of frustrated creatives who make films, because it's presumably the director's word God. And you talked earlier about one of the things you get your students to do is to be better at communicating their ideas, so communicating the great idea. So how does that work? How does the communication work? And well, basically I'm saying, what do you say to your students to try and get them to communicate better? And does that then allow a greater input of creativity from the other people to create a more corporate, consensual vision for what the film's about?
But this is really, really hard, and it takes years to actually master the whole thing. And I made a lot of mistakes in the beginning of my career, indeed, by always thinking that I had to have all the answers, which is actually not right. As a film director, you don't have to have the answers. You question and you debate. I suppose for the students, what I try to say to them is like, listen, there's nothing wrong to debate a creative idea. But the moment you make it personal, you have crossed a line that is almost impossible to repair. And because film production is a long process and you need everyone on board. You can have disagreements, but they
so what you're saying, Gisli, is it's okay to say, I don't think that's a very good idea. It's not okay to say, I think you've come up with a really daft idea.
There you are. Exactly. There's a fundamental difference between the two, because all of a sudden it's personal. What do you mean? Why are you always saying, Alastair, that it's always me? You didn't come up with a good idea. All of a sudden we start to make it personal, rather than say, oh, okay, you don't think it's a good idea. What else do you suggest? Which is, of course, the logical response. So what do you suggest? How about we do it like this? Oh my God, yes, of course. And here's the thing, because I have been pulled out of a bad decision by my collaborators so often, because I hadn't seen, because being a film director is like you're an orchestrator. You're involved with so many aspects of the film, so you're not always going to see the right idea. You go for the best idea. We've established that, but it's not necessarily the right idea. And sometimes you have people, and that's why, for example, a cinematographer and a film director work very, very closely together during the film production, the shooting stage. And then you work closely with the editor, and then you work closely with the sound designer, and then you work closely with the composer. Sadly, composers always end up having quite a
right at the end
time, because everyone
right
else
at the end. Right at the end.
So and here's the thing: it takes years. And when you sit there in the mixing room, which is basically like a cinema, and all these elements have come together, that's the birth of the film. And it's a magical moment, Alastair. It's an absolute magic. You can just feel and see and hear and almost smell the blood, sweat, and tears that all the people that you've been working with for such a long time. But it doesn't happen until the music is there, because the music somehow is the soul. For me, it's the soul of the audiovisual. We say audiovisual project. It's what brings out the soul in the narrative.
What I guess one of my problems with film, Gisli, to be honest, is I sometimes, if I'm watching a film with somebody else, and I say to them, "So what did you think of the music?" And they say, "What music?" Yeah. And they haven't actually noticed that there was music for 3/4 of the film, and it was being used. And I was listening to the music, being trained as a musician. Yeah. And sometimes I feel, oh God, so they're using those chromatic arpeggios again. So that means X is going to happen in 2 minutes' time. And I think, oh, they're using the music to manipulate me, to make me feel what they think I ought to be feeling. Well, sod them. I'm not going to fall for that trick.
No, I hear you, and I wonder.
So the music can be a real distraction. Well, is a real distraction for me anyway, and I guess for others. And you were using that example of the Bourne conspiracy, of the camera not being able to keep up. I think if I had watched that, I'd have thought, Oh, so they're trying to make this look naturalistic, and they're trying to make it look as though this guy's walking in a different way. And I would feel kind of, yeah, manipulated is the word.
No, of course, it is. Like I say, it is first and foremost a spectacle, but all the way through, you are being manipulated into the
Yeah.
state of mind.
There is a
that,
choreography. There is a
yeah,
choreography of the film.
absolutely, and you're right. I mean, quite often the music is there almost to give you a permission, almost to the almost to the comical tune of dun dun
Dun,
dun, dun, dun, dun, dun, dun, dun, dun, when there's
yeah.
because
Yeah,
what
yeah.
does it say? It says no, you're supposed to laugh here, and there's nothing wrong with it because it also sort of guides the audience. And quite frankly, the audience today has tremendous visual vocabulary. They already understand what certain shot means, and what, once you cut these shots together, because we've been looking at it for such a long time, and people have a firm understanding what it is. And of course they will always catch the music. And there is a saying that the best film music is music that you should never hear. I don't necessarily agree with that. My all-time favorite film, and a film that I would say, if you want to learn how to make a film, watch Amadeus. And you will realize the magic of cinema, the costumes and lights and editing and acting and music. All of these things come together in one enormous spectacle. It is spectacular, but it's an incredibly powerful story that is actually supported by all the tools that is available to the filmmaker, and it's a prime sample of that.
You said earlier that film refuses to die and won't die. Cinema refuses to die. I have an 11-year-old daughter who watches loads of YouTube videos of the most execrable, appalling quality, some of them, with the most disgustingly impoverished production, bad acting, crude sound, crude everything, and she loves them. The old idea with the BBC, with children's films on the BBC, was that children deserve and require high production values. They deserve things to be done properly. Well, according to my daughter and her friends, they don't care. They don't care whether it looks good, sounds good, or is well produced. So the vocabulary that she's developing isn't actually a very sophisticated vocabulary. And if you talked about her taste, her developing taste, then I'm afraid that's not very promising. So is film, which is at the expensive end of the spectrum, how come film and cinema survives when the taste and the expectations of younger people seems to be getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper?
No, I mean, I get lost on TikTok like anyone else, because you just have that numb experience where you just scroll through one clip after another. You have a laugh every now and then you can't remember at all what you just did. But so it is an incredibly, and again, I don't think we really understand fully the whole phone experience and having all this information in our hand, and entertainment as well. But I don't believe that you will ever replace the experience that has been with us since we decided to actually take shelter in a cave, where we would sit down and the hunters would come in with the meat, and then they will tell us the story about how they got it. Yeah, so that's an experience that, like I say, we know cognitively actually has a positive growth. And not only that, we also, and as we know already with the literature, cinema has the similar power, is that when we see, for example, a young couple in the northern province of China lose their child, it is an incredibly sad and moving experience, and we all cry, because the filmmakers allow time for that moment to pass through, and there's no music, and it's really, we think it's an incredibly sad experience. What we're doing, actually, we're practicing our own
absolutely. And because
reaction.
we've seen reality crystallized as one particular event, one particular couple in northern China.
Yeah.
But it's a reality, it's a crystallization that we can then adopt ourselves and understand through our experience as well of grief. So there is something transmissible. Whilst you were talking about the sort of communal aspect of watching a film and the benefits we get from that, I, for some reason, thought about some years ago, I was in Morocco, and in a market square in Morocco, and there was a storyteller set up his stall in the middle, and about 150 people gathered around him, Moroccans. And I couldn't understand what he was saying, obviously, but I was watching the interaction between this professional storyteller and his audience, and he held them in the palm of his hand, and they were enthralled. And they weren't just enthralled as a series of one-to-one experiences between the listener and the speaker. They were enthralled because they were in a group of their friends, and it was a communal, it was, as you say, it was a communal activity, which is, I think, similar to what you're saying is the power of sitting in a cinema with friends, watching a movie and then discussing it afterwards. I remember when as a child, I used to go to the cinema quite a lot, often with my sister, my older sister, and we used to really enjoy, afterwards, seeing the film, coming out and looking at all the photographs outside that showed stills from the film and saying, do you remember that bit, Ros? Do you remember that bit? And oh yeah, that was when she came in and I just had a bath, you know. And it was that was part of the fun, the analysis afterwards, the communal analysis.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like I say, I have no expertise there, but I'm pretty sold on the idea. But what happens also when you have a group of people or we come together, our behavior changes. You see, I mean, I don't go often to football matches, but I go sometimes with friends, and they're completely different people when they're on the stadium, and I am quite shocked, and because I'm not really brought up in these large stadiums and all. I enjoy the whole experience, but you realize people are different when we come together. We behave completely differently when we are by ourselves.
Sometimes for the better, sometimes for worse.
Sometimes better, sometimes for the worse. But if we look at cinema, this is a lot more controlled environment than a football match, because of course emotions can completely lead you to a silly actions on a football match, a very tribal reaction. Whereas in the cinema, you are still in a similar way. You are allowing yourself to enjoy the experience in a congregation, if that makes sense. I mean, of course, there's also the argument that, you know, the image quality and the sound quality is so much better. But then, yeah, not really. I mean, I have got a, 8K TV at home. There's massive and sound equipment. And quite frankly, sometimes I watch the same film that I've seen in the cinema and I watch it there. And there's a lot of little details that I missed in the cinema.
Oh, right.
But that's probably me, because I'm being analytical about it. And just like if you
so the superior technology argument for cinema is diminishing as people get better and better home systems. So it's got to be the communal going out, the event, the spectacle.
Yes and no, because here's the other thing. There is no remote control in the cinema, and you're in a dark area. And what happens is that it is almost as if there's something really neurological interesting that is happening, because you start to make that connection between the screen and you're not engaged in any other sort of activity except maybe have a sip of Coca-Cola and eat some popcorn. But your interaction with the screen is so completely different than when you're doing it at home.
You know, the thing that I find tricky, another thing I find tricky about cinema is it doesn't know I'm watching. Right. The film doesn't know I'm there. And if I hate the film and stand up and shout, rubbish, get off, the film will just roll on. It doesn't know, it takes no notice of me at all. Now, in every other artistic medium, I can do something about it. Even if I'm reading a book, I can tear it up. I can tear up the book and destroy the book. In a theatre, I could end the show if I wanted to by screaming and getting hauled out. That lack of empathy or knowledge even of who's watching is, I think, a problem for cinema. for me anyway.
Okay, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a problem, because it's also what I believe is the power of cinema. It really, but no, I mean, what happens is simply is that people don't go and see the film.
Don't go and
because,
see, so it's an empty house.
yeah. And here's the sad truth about cinema. Cinema is only good or bad. There is nothing in between. If it's a good film, they will survive. If it's a bad film, we won't. It's a terrible, terrible truth, but it's a fact. No one goes to cinema to see a film. Yeah, it's not too bad. But wait,
No.
why would we go and see something that is not too bad? We want to go and see something. But also going back to what I said earlier, we first ask our partners, friends, and loved ones, shall we go to the cinema tonight? Yeah, let's go.
Yeah,
okay,
and
what should we
then
watch?
So the
And then
first,
comes the,
yeah,
or are we going to see a comedy or something like that? I mean,
Yeah.
even nowadays when we're scrolling through the streaming services, it's starting to be a frustrating affair, because you've seen quite a lot of it. There's a huge amount of catalog of work but you're just not interested in seeing it.
yeah, yes.
And why is that?
Yeah.
I don't know, but but the sleeper hits, they will sooner or later. It's like what it's called, Squid Games.
Yes.
Korea. I mean, we've known about Korea for quite some time.
Yes.
Remember, and now it's sort of the quality of work that's been coming from there is just extraordinary. Out of nowhere, this becomes the most viewed series on Netflix.
Yes.
And it's a huge success. I mean, it's quite crude. It's you've seen these things several times before in a different sort of packaging, but really entertaining. And it did find its audience. Most people would ask themselves, what, Korean? I've never seen anything Korean. I mean, I even have staff members here who would like, do you know anything about Korean movies? Hell yeah. We want me to give you a list. It's quite amazing.
You've
And then
worked
they
in
come back
Southeast Asia, so that helps.
absolutely astonished. They had never seen anything like that. But good stuff will always call for attention.
Can I move the conversation a little bit now, Gisli, to your work in education, specifically on the education side? And I suspect there are quite a lot of people watching this video, perhaps young people, 15, 16-year-olds, who are interested and would have as an ambition and aspiration to join a school like yours at some stage in the future. I know your particular school is postgraduate, but so they will have to do something else first. But just thinking about an average 15 or 16-year-old who's fanatical about film and wants to move into that industry, what kind of things would you like them to be doing now whilst they're 15 or 16, which would impress you in 5 years' time when they're thinking about applying to your school?
I think earlier we mentioned, we talked about, do you have anything to say? I think it's unfair to any 15 or 16-year-old put that pressure on themselves of I understand, love for a certain industry and all that, but it's unfair and not very wise to put such pressure on oneself. I would say, read books, live, go and do things you'd be scolded for, go and learn things that the more you engage with life, the better storyteller you will become. And that's what I'm trying to say, actually. You're not a filmmaker, you're a storyteller. And that goes for the sound designer, that goes for the cinematographer, it goes for everyone that works on a film project or television nowadays. Because the industry is sort of starting to change quite a lot. It used to be quite well defined between television and cinema. Nowadays, we're using the same equipment. We are using similar budgets and similar schedules, and the appetite for high-end series is growing as we know. So for me, I don't actually recommend. I think it's unwise to go and take an undergraduate in film. I know there's a lot of people who will probably be upset about that. I would say no, continue developing other skills and your appetite and your ability to actually, you see, as a filmmaker, usually what you have to prepare for is that you're going to see in your research, because you don't have to be an astronaut to make a films about an astronaut, but you need to research it. And as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, you will get to see the worst in human behavior, as well as, you know, the best in human behavior, because that's the scope of the job, you know, and is what makes up stories.
So you're saying that the 15 or 16-year-old should be living life so they can develop the stories or experience life positively and negatively. You also used an interesting word. You said you should do things that you might get scolded for. So so implying that they should be taking risks. They should be doing things, unconventional things they might be told off for doing. Because that sort of danger and that sort of exposure to new experiences, some of which will be possibly antisocial or at least frowned upon, is good preparation for understanding how the world works. And that's what you're looking for in students?
I don't think I'm encouraging antisocial behavior, but obviously not. But I think you put it in a better word than I, indeed, to do take risk and experiment with your abilities of you know, in terms of creating, and in terms of, and accept. I mean, it has been said that, you know, failure is the mother of success, and I don't believe in the word failure. I don't think we ever fail. I think we are just, you know, we're not as successful as we would like it to be. But failure is not a failure, you know, as it has been defined in this saying. I don't really accept that. I think it's important.
Sorry to interrupt you, Gisli. There's an artwork, a Singaporean artwork actually, by a Singaporean artist, which argues, the artwork argues that failure is part of success. And success cannot exist and must not exist without failure, because the failure is an intrinsic part of the success.
Yeah. No, I mean, I always see it all, like navigating a complex map. Is that you go down a road, it's like, oh, no, okay, that's not really the road. And you go back and then you find another one. So, and for me, that is indeed, you know, it's navigating a very complex system that is your own creativity. So yeah, get scolded for it, absolutely. But then, you know, and not necessarily to sort of react in any arrogant way and think any less of those who are scolding you for it. But it's almost to like test the boundaries in many ways, and because, and then of course be interested in human beings. I mean, I'm obviously can only talk as a film director and someone who's involved with the storytelling aspect, story development aspect of filmmaking. Is that if I would not be interested in human beings, I wouldn't be able to sit down and actually come up with ideas about, even though quite often we use archetypes. I mean, a policeman can be just a policeman, but what if we make the policeman also a gardener? Okay, and then et cetera, et cetera. You build characters, but you don't necessarily have to, like I say, have. They have said, you know, write what you know about. Well, okay, but you can make quite a pretty extensive research of what it takes to become an astronaut, and therefore you can make a drama about an astronaut. You don't have to go up in space.
How do you, when you're interviewing a student, or when a potential student comes to you wanting a place in your school, how do you judge whether their creativity is ready for your kind of study?
Well, I mean, very often it's in the work that they submit. Very often it is in the articulation during an interview, how they articulate their, and often it's about how willing and ready are you to pick up new knowledge, really. Because one thing, what I've found is that if students have too much experience before they come into a school like ours, they are more than happy to help us to teach. And actually, they might not necessarily have the right knowledge, but they might actually have a really, really bad practice that they are trying to instill on everyone else. So it's almost better that you don't have too much filmmaking experience. But I would celebrate any kind of, I mean, we have a lot of solicitors coming in for us. I mean, that's something which is quite interesting. And I know a lot of solicitors and lawyers who have done an undergraduate degree in law and then moved into filmmaking. Because law, no matter what law you actually do study, does allow you a very interesting lens into human behavior.
Absolutely.
Uh, uh,
Also a form of storytelling too, because
yeah,
the way a barrister will put a case together is a sequence of arguments, a sequence of events,
yeah,
which draw the judge or the jury to an inevitable conclusion. And so
exactly.
they are already kind of movie directors in terms of organizing what should happen next and how much time to spend on each thing,
That,
drawing it through to a conclusion.
absolutely. And remember, one of the key tool in the barrister's uh,
Armory.
armory is to build empathy with the
Oh,
person
that's a
they're
good point.
defending,
Yeah, yeah, and also to
or
build apparent empathy with the judge or with the jury as well, so
exactly,
they'll sympathize with them. Yeah.
exactly.
So a preparation, so an undergraduate degree in law, is quite an attractive proposition for applicants coming to you.
Absolutely.
As
Um,
would I guess a more conventional undergraduate degree in creative writing, for example.
that's phenomenal, and we do have indeed, yeah. I mean, film studies, and like I say, what filmmaking. I mean, it's silly to talk about traditionally, but the school of the old, such as ours. I mean, we've been around since 1956. These sort of early film schools were always delivered at, they wouldn't. I remember there was even an age restriction around 25 or 26, which basically indicated don't bother coming here until
There is
you
also in
live a
some
little.
drama schools today, there is still age restrictions, or there are norms that you wouldn't actually recruit an acting student, particularly a male acting student, until he's in his mid-20s,
Yeah.
because you don't know the world enough. But yeah, so when that law graduate or dance graduate or creative writing graduate comes to you and wants to join your postgraduate course, is it a question that does the course basically therefore either does the course assume that that person comes with the creativity already and that what you're doing is adding the craft skills to that creativity, or are you concerned with a holistic approach to the craft and the creativity?
Well, I think we definitely we are a holistic. We have a holistic approach to the filmmaking education, and I suppose that's part of our success also because we have many graduates who are very successful producers, yet they've directed films and they've done sound on films and etc. etc. No, I mean that's the whole thing with the intake process and the application form and the portfolio submitted and the interviews afterwards, is that are you being realistic about your own talent? Do you understand that this is a very cutthroat industry?
So that's stressing, so that's asking them to examine their own creativity, their own imaginations, to see whether
Yeah,
it's up to it.
and also how to come in with an open mind, because we have time and time again we have students who come in thinking that they want to direct the film, and it almost feels like 99% of all entries are I'm a director. And our response is, of course, no, you're not yet the director, but you want to be a director. And now you're taking this, 2 years of engagement to become a director. But be open-minded to actually allow your talent to guide you. And sure enough, by the end of these 2 years, the students have realized actually that no, they actually have a talent in something they never actually thought about before because they hadn't really been exposed to it. Like one of the most successful production designer, graduate of recent times, actually, he came in, brilliant director, actually, he did really well. But he really found this calling in designing, and sure enough, he hadn't even graduated when he was working on projects here in Britain. He's from Italy, and he's now still staying because there's so much work going on at the moment. And he's just a brilliant designer.
I was very pleased. About a month or so ago, a famous cinematographer died, I believe. It was on the news quite a lot, and he had worked on loads of films and had contributed to the creativity and had contributed to the art of the film massively. And I was very pleased that he got that publicity, because you're right, the attention is generally on the director,
Yeah.
and that your world is such a collaborative world that it's good to acknowledge the creativity that can come from elsewhere.
Yeah, I suppose the directors walk away with most of the attention because they are involved in every single stage of the film production. No, cinematographer is only involved with the cinematography stage, but they can have an immense influence on more than just the light or where the camera is positioned and the lens. They can have, because if at least on my set, the golden rule, the only person who is actually allowed to speak to the actor while the actor is in front of the camera is the cinematographer.
Really?
Now, why is that? Well, that's simply so that the actor, all the information come from one person. Because if we're shooting something and all of a sudden the actor just, goes to left rather than right, I'm going to call and say, hang on a second, what's going on? And they go like, oh, well, she told me to go over here. And I'm going, what? No, hang on a second. You've already wasted now quite a valuable time, etc. But so it's very, very clear that all information that needs to be conveyed to the actor have to go through the director, not for any filtering, just for clarification, so it's clear where everything comes from.
Just going back to the students and the student films, do you find the motivation that the students have I wonder, is that principally for the story that they're wishing to tell, or are they kind of just in love with film as a medium? Because there are films about film, aren't there?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I think we are quite privileged in terms of, because it's a postgraduate only, so students have had a lot of time to think about what they want to do. So most of them, I would like to say all of them come in very, very determined, really, really determined they know exactly what it is. They've done a lot of research, looked at film schools around the world. They've looked at the work that is here, and they're coming in with quite a lot of commitment to the art and craft of making a film. Some of them have a lot of good knowledge of film and film history. It's hard to say, because I think I want to believe that they do understand that without a good story at the heart of an excellent rendering of the craft, it's a film will never be successful. And I think that's part of also why graduate films from this school have been so successful and winning all these awards around the world, because they are. I'm not going to say I'm surprised, but every time when I see these graduation films, and many of them are so good, I'm just absolutely. I sometimes tear up of joy, really. I'm pride, of course, even though personally I've had nothing to do with the development of that author, and yet I take great pride because I know colleagues and this pedagogical model that we've been honoring for such a long time is extremely successful. It's not necessarily a pedagogical model that is acknowledging the latest technology, but it's really, 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 really crafting the core of the matter, which is the storytelling aspect. And I think we are really, really successful on that.
One of the other caricatures we have in working with creatives is called facilitator. And there's a debate about whether facilitators are themselves creative, or can they be creative through their facilitation. And my view is quite clear that facilitator is a creative.
Absolutely.
And what you've described in your own role is the joy of creative facilitation. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
Does that ring true for you?
Absolutely, because as you know, filmmaking is practice led. You can't teach filmmaking unless you make the film. It's a studio practice, and I sometimes sort of sit in on classes from colleagues, and even I am learning, because there's always these different takes, and the facilitator might be very successful, because quite a lot of our colleagues here are working professionals, and they come in between projects and they teach. And So to see them facilitate and to see the penny drop, if I may say
Yes,
so,
yeah, yeah.
is an extraordinary
It's
experience.
fabulous,
And
isn't it? It's a wonderful moment.
absolutely wonderful. And that's that you take so much joy from that, rather than, you know, sitting there in a classroom, in your classical Victorian style classroom, and be disappointed because most of the students forgot that they had to hand in their essay. And then all of a sudden you spend a lot of energy on being a frustrated teacher. It doesn't feel like that in this environment, because it is practice led, and quite often actually students and colleagues kind of forget that we are not a film production studio. We are an institution of higher education.
Yes, sure.
And again, there are, learning outcomes that need to be respected. Well, of course, graduate film is the sort of holy grail.
Yeah,
and that's what
all your students come out having made a film, don't they?
Yeah, most of them. But you can also choose to actually, because at the end of your learning journey, you get X amount of money to production allowance to put into a project. You can either use that for your own project, or you can actually team up with someone else, for example, and put that money into that film.
Just going back to your work as a facilitator and the joy you get from facilitating. So do you see your work in education as being part of your own creativity? Or is your creativity separate from your work as a facilitator of others' creativity?
I mean, for me personally, it's just two sides of the same coin.
Right,
because,
fine. I see.
Quite often I might be unpacking a film in a completely contradicting what students have read in respected.
So what do you mean by unpacking?
I would unpack, for example, let's say we screen a film like Blue Velvet, and then I unpack it and what my reading of the work of David Lynch is in that film, and then I show them the samples and make an argument for it. And this is simply to actually put them in the space of, yes, you might read all this knowledge and there might be a common sort of agreement on certain things, but never underestimate the individual that is actually directing, and you need to make up your own mind. And also the whole thing about, I don't know if it's the same thing in music, but we know already in literature is that the more you read it, the better writer you become, as in you're more educated about the canons and you know where it's all coming from. And it's the same thing, what I call the repertoire. You need to have certain films in your repertoire, because when you get into the period of your career where you're receiving scripts and you read something and it's a science fiction, then immediately I make a list of 10 science fiction films that I think are very similar, and then I go and review them, or I don't need to because I know, and I go, but mostly I will go to review them to see how they did it.
So this is you use the word canon, so the establishment of a frame of reference almost.
Yes.
Of knowledge, which provides a frame of reference against which you can understand or evaluate a new work.
And build your own.
Now, I can see that has advantages from a sort of a critical point of view, that you're not starting from scratch all the time. But it surely has dangers as well, in that it is exclusive, it's arguably elitist, it's harder to break into if it's not in the canon already.
No, and almost to the point that I use the word we in education have failed to actually remind students that, somebody somewhere said, if you want to steal from the best. And I'm going like, no, hang on a second. I've never said steal. I said learn.
Yes, sure.
So what we're seeing time and time again lately, and I'm not going to name any names, that there have been very celebrated films where you go like, hang on a second, this is not acceptable, because they literally are copying one film, but the center of gravity of the narrative is completely different. So whatever aesthetics they have now transported over are just not making any sense. But they just took something that just actually looked beautiful, but it just doesn't.
Yeah, well, this is in the academic world. That's just plagiarism, isn't it? That's you've plagiarized somebody else's work.
Literally,
without the footnotes saying that you've done it.
Exactly. No, well, these young authors went on very proudly in interviews. They acknowledge this, and you go like, no, but that's then we have failed as educators of saying, you know, the whole thing is about inspiration, and we know that in art and in painting that of course you are referring quite time and time again to other
To others'
painting,
work, yes, of course.
but and other work, yeah, and references is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But like I say, when you take the context out of it and you just take part of the aesthetics and try to glue it onto something else, there's something wrong going on here.
Yeah, and unless, of course, that's what the film is about. The film could conceivably be about incompatible aesthetics.
And that would be quite,
And
that would be quite
yeah.
ironic.
Do you find when working with students, your students, that they enrich your creativity when, as a filmmaker yourself?
Absolutely, because like I say, part of my teaching is like, listen, I'm going to say some outrageous things here because I'm now telling you how I look at it. I'm not saying anything about, and like I say, I mean, Tokyo Story, I unpacked that film completely contradicting all written work about that great film, but I'm basing it on living 12 years in Japan and having been married to a Japanese. So my understanding of that film is based on that. I'm not presenting it as the only truth. I'm saying here's a point of view on that work that you can't actually find anywhere. And if I'm presenting it in such a way that you feel compelled to challenge me on it, do so, because that's part of growing a creative voice, of really not stubbornly stick to it, but challenge you, going back to the debate point. Debate it with me. Tell me why you do it offends you. Tell me why you think that's not the right thing. I'm not going to change my mind about it because it's a conviction that is based on an emotional attachment, but it should evoke some kind of response from you. And so the lesson of this is, if you want to stay in this, if you want to do this business, you have to come up with your own perspective and your own assessment of aesthetics, and your own, you have to have ownership of what you want to achieve with every work that you work on.
Yeah, I suppose some people, having learned that lesson, would turn into mini dictators because they have developed such a strong, determined view of what they are wanting to say that they will hear no other voices at all.
Well, no, not necessarily, because I mean, like I say, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the reason why I have come to this conclusion, and I'm not saying they are wrong, I'm just offering a different perspective on as a filmmaker, because a lot that in this particular work, Tokyo Story, a lot has been written about it from learned and fantastic scholars. I mean, really good, very well respected people, but they give a different perspective on it. So all I'm trying to teach them is that as a film director, it's not about being a little dictator. It's about understanding your source material and your material and what you're trying to achieve. Now, one more time, the process is so long. You also need the ability of like I say, I don't believe that you're compromising. Compromises are, for some reason, I believe it feels far more. Well, it's something that I don't subscribe to, because it's a creative process. You're constantly adapting. You're not compromising. You're adapting to a situation, and you are sort of, and in the process as well, you are learning. Let's face it. You are aiming at going somewhere, but going there, if you're not still open to actually adding new ideas and new perspectives on the journey, it will never be a rich journey. It will be a rather empty little trip.
I know some artists, particularly young artists, who have had some initial commercial success. I'm talking about fine artists, painters, then spend the rest of their career painting exactly the same picture. Well, with, in a different color or slightly differently. And it always seems very sad. And I remember talking to an educator, a fine art educator, saying that he was, in such a situation, he would encourage the students to do things that weren't necessarily going to be as successful as the stuff they'd done before, to keep them experimenting, to keep them thinking. Presumably there are filmmakers who make the same film over and over again.
Well, yeah, but that's not necessarily the filmmakers.
Or that would be the studio saying, let's have the same again because the last one was successful.
well, most of the time you're pigeonholed. If you're good with kids, all of a sudden the only projects that come your way are kids. Or if you're good with something, you know, it's like nowadays nobody is doing any science fiction movies except Denis Villeneuve, because he's been doing these series of science fiction movies, and it's sort of it's the thinking that, yeah, no, he's good at it, but what are you good at? And we see this in music, we see this everywhere, that people are you know, pigeonholed very, very easily, and I'm not really sure why that is. And you know, because again, a creative person will always find a new and interesting angle on.
Well, one answer to what's going on there is that they're actually not very creative. What they are good is at the craft of that particular genre. There's a story, you know, the Ritz Hotel in London, where I'm sure you have lunch every day, where there's apparently a pastry chef there who just makes one dessert. And he's been making this dessert for the last 25 years. And it doesn't do anything else, but it makes that one dessert perfectly. And I know for a fact, that's only a myth, but I know for a fact that there's a guy working in the Hamburg Steinway factory making pianos who just makes the hammer for the C sharp above middle C. And he was once asked, I asked him, don't you ever get bored doing that? And he said, well, management was asking me to go on to try doing the E flat hammer. And I tried it for a bit, but no, it wasn't the same. And that's craft. That's craft. And nothing. This isn't to denigrate craft skills, but there are craft skills that can do the same thing over and over again perfectly. But the difference between craft and creativity, at least to my mind, is that craft is about solidifying a social view. It's about security. It's essentially a conservative way of organizing and reinforcing the society you've already got. Whereas creativity, with its risk-taking and its potential for being told off for doing something wrong and making lots of mistakes, is a far more risky and exciting, varied way of being a human being.
I suppose indeed, if you strip it down, it's absolutely that. But then, you know, the art world in Britain, at least, is actually, I think it's threefold the film industry. Actually, there's quite a lot of money here, and so very often it's the market that controls really these decisions. I remember one of my friends had the unfortunate, although he got a lot of money, but he had the unfortune of having a hit in the 80s. And he was like, oh, so he's like a one-hit wonder. Well, no, actually, he wrote a catalog that was just sold to Warner Music for $2 million the other day. But he wrote several albums, but this is the only song that actually became well known. And he completely lost his track because the record label asked him for two albums exactly with that same kind of song. So they put all of a sudden restriction on him. He wasn't trying to actually stay because let's face it, most of the time nobody knows. He had no idea why this song became this massive hit. He pretended he knew, but at the end of the day he didn't. And most of the time we think we know what film is going to be hit, but most of the time we really don't know. And I think there was a writer called William Goldman that wrote a book in the 80s called Nobody Knows Anything. And it was indeed about that actually, you know, it's all a myth that we think actually which film will be the most popular film of the decade. You can put a lot of advertising into it. Like I said, nobody has the intention to make a £4 million endeavor unsuccessful. Everyone starts with the intention of making it successful, but a lot of things can happen.
Yeah. Gisli, I've taken up far too much of your time. Thank you so much for working with creatives this morning, and the very best of luck with your filmmaking and with your excellent school. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alastair. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Good, thank you.